Hello, welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Matthew Lucas.
And I'm Stephen Ryan, and we post a video every week, so why not subscribe and press the alert button.
And Stephen, where are we today? We are not in familiar territory.
We are certainly not in familiar territory, but we're somewhere not that far away.
Okay.
And today we're going to learn everything you've ever wanted to know
about
a genus of plants that have become extremely fashionable,
Yep.
and that's the Helleborus.
Did you say Hellebore?
Yes, aversion therapy for Matthew. By the end of this video, he is going to be so enamored with Helleborus, he's going to fill his whole house up with them.
Oh my goodness.
Here we
me.
go. So,
well, it's been brewing for a while. We've mentioned Hellebores a lot
Yeah.
because they're a very useful plant and they're very popular. So we are actually in a specialist Hellebore nursery, and we're going to talk to the owner, Peter Leigh, who is, we can say, because he's not here to be embarrassed, one of the world's great Hellebore breeders and growers.
he certainly is, and this nursery is an amazing site. So we're going to show you how to propagate them, how to look after them, how to grow them. Virtually everything you could ever want to know about Hellebores should be in this video.
Yes, and already, viewers, I have to say, I am loving them.
I knew it'd work. I knew it'd work.
We should go meet Peter and just find out about Hellebore 101.
What a good idea. Well, everybody, I'd like to introduce you to Peter Leigh, Post Office Farm Nursery, Ashbourne in Victoria, only 10-15 minutes away from where I come from. And Peter and I have known each other for quite some years.
We have.
But Peter, the people out there don't know you, and we'd like to know what on earth started you in the world of Helleborus.
Well, Stephen, I started off just like a lot of people growing them as an amateur in
Yes.
my little garden. I lived in Brunswick at the time.
In a city of Melbourne.
I bought the property and decided to do the garden, and Hellebores was something that I started growing. It just sort of got a bit out of control from there.
Only a little bit out of control.
Is that called an obsession? And how long have you been commercially operating here?
20 years. This is our 20th anniversary, in fact.
Happy birthday!
Thank you, thank you.
Well, we're very lucky to be here. Thank you so much for giving us your day. You're very busy. The Hellebores are in flower, so it's peak season. So I'm curious, so we start at the very beginning, which is the Hellebore species. Where are they from, and what's the origin of all of these hybrids?
Okay, Matthew, let's go.
All right, let's go.
Now, Peter, I guess from my perspective, I'd like to start with, where do Hellebores come from? So what parts of the world can you find wild Hellebores?
In the wild, you'll find them in the Mediterranean area, so north the Mediterranean, so countries as far west as the Pyrenees in Spain, through Italy and Greece and the Balkan countries. There's quite a concentration of them. Usually found in more inland, higher altitude, mountainous areas.
Now, the extremes, though, if I'm right, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, so don't hesitate, one of the species can be found wild in England.
Yes.
And then, of course, you've got species that come from as far across as China.
Yes, yeah. The English ones, I think there's probably some debate as to whether they're actually
Truly native.
or been introduced sometime over the centuries. And there is an outlier species found in central China. In the sort of European area, they go across as far as Turkey and into Syria, which is actually part of Asia. And so there's a continuous sort of distribution of them from, I guess, the Western Europe all the way through to there.
Right.
And then a big gap through to thibetanus in China.
Good. So I guess that leads to the next question, which of course is, how many are there out there? How many recognised species are there in the genus?
Well, Stephen, as with a lot of plants, it's a bit of an argument.
Yeah.
Around about 16 or so, but in some of the groups of them, there is some debate going on about exactly how many species there are. It's not entirely clear.
And all right, now I'm aware that the genus is sort of, in a way, split into two basic groups. What you'd call the stemmed and the unstemmed Hellebores, or the coalescent or the acoalescent Hellebores, if you're going to be really specific about it. And I guess this is the point where we show people the difference between the two different groups. So if we start from this end, we've got one of my favourite Hellebores, which I think is a great garden plant. So what's this one all about?
That's Helleborus argutifolius, or the earlier name was Helleborus corsicus.
Yep.
That actually, having just said they're all from inland mountainous areas, that's actually from the island of Corsica, but inland mountainy areas of Corsica.
Yep.
And it's a taller growing species, can get up to even a metre high.
Yeah.
In a pot like as it is here, it's probably not super happy. Much better in the ground. Lovely green flowers and sort of trifoliate foliage. And that is an example of one of the stemmed or coalescent hellebores.
Now, just to make it clear to people what the difference between a stemmed and a non-stemmed hellebore is, because they've all got what you would basically call a stem. If I say something incorrect, pull me up. A stemmed hellebore has a quite firm stem, and the foliage and the flowers are all attached to the one structure. So that's a stemmed hellebore. A non-stemmed hellebore will have flower scapes, which are not classically stems, and the true leaves are around the bottom. Is that correct?
Correct, Stephen, yes.
Yeah. All right, so we've had a look at argutifolius as a stemmed hellebore. Here we've got another species. What's this one, Peter?
This is Helleborus odorus. It's one of the ones found in the Balkan areas, and it has the flower stems emerging directly from the rhizome.
Yep.
There's actually no leaves as such. We've cut all the leaves off. It will, after flowering, then have leaves coming up on separate stems.
Now, they say odorus. Yeah, maybe.
No, not so much. They're not all fragrant. There are some. There's probably some more reliably fragrant hellebores.
Yeah. Now we need to talk about some of the other stemmed ones, because this one's also a bit of an outlier, because again it's an island species.
Another island dweller.
Yeah. So lividus, where does this one come from?
This one comes from the island of Majorca. It's very closely related to argutifolius that we just looked at. You can see that by the shape of the leaves, that trifoliate foliage, but without the heavily spiny margins, and with a lovely, much more of a pink colour, hence the name, through the flowers, and a lovely silvery veined foliage.
It's a beautiful plant.
It is a beautiful plant.
So, if I take this one from Majorca and I take it to Corsica and the two meet up, what do I end up with, Peter?
They'll get on very, very well, and they will have offspring, and that's called Helleborus cross sternii.
All right.
That's an example.
There we go, look at that.
Typically with hellebores there's a lot of natural variability, and this hybrid shows a lot of natural variability. So lots of different forms. This is one that we have, which has this sort of lovely smoky grey foliage.
It's beautiful.
It is, but you can see the foliage picks up more, and the whole plant picks up a lot of the colour from lividus, but gets those more spiny leaves from argutifolius.
So it has picked up characteristics from both of its parents.
And it's a bigger plant than lividus, and probably more robust.
And if we were going to grow these in the garden, are they easy?
Yeah, lividus maybe would be the only one. All of these taller growing hellebores we're talking about now need really good drainage. So if they get a bit waterlogged, they will be unhappy. Lividus is probably the fussiest in that regard, but sternii and argutifolius are quite easy to grow.
Fantastic. This has got to be probably one of the most famous of the hellebores, well known in England as a Christmas rose.
It is. That's the common name, the Christmas rose. This is Helleborus niger.
Now, niger is an interesting term as well, and we probably should define that, because it normally means black or dark.
It does cause a lot of confusion. Sometimes people request a Helleborus niger and expect they're going to get a black flowered one, but almost certainly they're going to get a white flowered one. The term niger actually refers to the colour, I think was when it was originally described as a plant, the colour of the roots.
Now, it is one of the few hellebores that has sort of outward facing flowers of the wild species.
It is. It's probably the main one where those sorts of plants are bred from, yes.
Yeah. And this particular one has got quite beautifully marbled leaves. Now, that's not always common.
No, that's an unusual. This is our marbled leaf form of niger, which is less common, but typically they would just have the normal greenish foliage.
How would you find this as far as ease for a garden plant?
Growing in the wild is found in sort of cooler areas, and it tends to, in the garden situation, grow best in cooler areas. So in Australia, higher altitude, cooler areas. Probably not so tough as some of the hellebores are.
And of course, something that could be sort of considered a creme de la creme in hellebores is this one, which you mentioned before, because this is the one that comes from central China.
This is the Chinese species hellebore, Helleborus thibetanus. It's actually from central China, not directly from Tibet. And it is a deciduous species, so it actually
disappears completely?
Disappears completely, usually at the end of spring and into summer. And then emerges in late autumn and winter. Always has these sort of pinkish flowers.
But again, this isn't going to be everybody's
bit of a challenge. It needs to be kept cool in summer during its dormant period and not dried out completely.
But it is a beautiful thing, and it's lovely to see that it's in the country. Well, Peter, I think that's fantastic. I think the next thing we need to do is go off and talk a little bit about how you produce these. So pollination and growing on, I think, is where we go next.
Absolutely, Steve.
All right, Peter, let's talk about the birds and the bees first observation, no bees in your pollination room.
No bees in here. This is our stock house, and
Yes.
this is where we do all of our hand pollinating.
Yep.
And all of the seed we grow the plants from comes from in here. So I've tried talking to the bees and explaining
won't
to
listen.
them that I want that one crossed with that one, but they won't listen, so we keep them out.
Now, how do you actually physically do that? Just netting?
Just netting on around the openings of the house,
Yeah.
on the doors.
So that's the first point, keep pollinators away, which is kind of counterintuitive to what so many people think about pollination. My mind is exploding about how do you begin with a particular flower to decide you're going to cross it with something else to try and get something else? I mean, how does this work?
It's a bit of a combination of sort of art and science,
Yeah.
a bit of understanding.
A dark art, I feel.
A dark art, a bit of an understanding of how the genetics work, which is
Yeah.
sort of trial and error.
Yeah.
And they're quite complicated Hellebores. So Hellebores, I always say Hellebores are a bit like people. They're infinitely variable.
Yes.
This is no two people are apart from identical twins are the same.
Yeah.
Hellebores are very much the same. They have incredible variation in flower colour, form, foliage,
Yeah.
particularly these ones which are the hybrids,
Yeah.
Helleborus cross hybridus,
Yeah.
or what used to be called orientalis hybrids.
But what about the colour and the traits? So if you want to try and go for a particular colour or a particular, like this has the most beautiful speckling. Is that often just trial and error that the seedling will turn up and...
That's a dominant trait in Hellebores, the spotting, which is a common thing. So
see.
that's a bit of a sort of thing about Hellebores is spotting. You get that in lots of different colour forms.
Yeah.
This is a single flowered white spotted Hellebore, which is reasonably common. But it's sort of understanding that, or we're always trying to improve particular forms.
Yeah.
So get better forms of this one, more rounded. The flower shape is an important thing that we take into account. We like nice round shaped sepals. It's
Yeah.
actually sepals, not petals on Hellebore.
Now I did notice here the fabulous pollination book, and I'm also seeing codes. So how do you track all of this, and how long can it take from the initial pollination to having a viable plant that you want to put into the market?
Well, just going from this year, if we're pollinating now in winter, it'll take 3 years till we see the results of those pollinations.
Yeah.
So more or less next year the seedlings will germinate,
Yes.
and then 2 years to flowering. So 3 years altogether. So it's a fairly slow process, not as slow as in some genera of plants,
Yeah.
but it takes a while. So we're always sort of working backwards, and the plants we have flowering this year are what we did 3 years ago.
So in 3 years, when you've got that first flowering, is that something that is sort of stable, that you're going to be happy
No.
with, or is there a further process of observation
No.
over generations?
It would typically take probably 6 to 9 years. You're probably looking at 2 or 3 generations. From a new cross, we'll get those first seedlings flowering in 3 years' time. We'll have a look at how much variation there is in that, and then we'll cross some of those, and probably then the next generation you'll sort of get a better idea about how variable it is and whether it's stable.
So let's talk about record keeping. Obviously that is very important. You've got to know what you crossed with what. And I did notice this incredible sort of spreadsheet and then the code on the back. How do you keep records, and what do all these things mean?
Well, that's a map that was done by Penny, one of our staff here, which helps us because this is a relatively new stock house.
You have a
Somebody
map.
do a nice map so I can find things are until I get used to this new stock house. And on the other side is a list of our staff here and who's responsible for pollinating what, because I can't do everything.
Now the other thing I noticed too, which is the first thing that caught my eye, is that there are coloured ties on a lot of the blooms. What does that indicate?
The twist ties mean that flower's actually been pollinated.
Right. So obviously then you need to keep your eye on the seed pod and only use that one that you've tied?
Yeah. So it's we only collect seed from the flowers that we've got the twist tie on. Then we come back in a couple of months' time and we put bags. We have muslin type bags that we put on all those flowers that have been pollinated, so the seed drops into those bags.
Right.
Then we come back again and collect all that seed, and then we sow the seed.
This is sounding very labour intensive.
It's a lot of mucking around.
Well, I think you have offered to give us a pollination masterclass. So what we might do is just take a closer look at how you go about it.
The first step in pollination is to have a trusty pair of tweezers, which we use. Some people use paintbrushes, but we find tweezers are better. It keeps things clean if you're pollinating multiple different plants. So we find a flower which is nice and open, like this one here, where the anthers have started to shed some pollen. You can see that flower there. The anthers are shedding around the outside and they're nice and fluffy. And we can grab a couple of those anthers with the tweezers. Then we usually find a flower which hasn't fully opened, it hasn't started to shed its own pollen. such as this one here. So the anthers on that haven't started shedding yet, so that won't have pollinated itself. And we then just dab the pollen from the end of those anthers onto the stigma, which is in the central part of the flower, the female part of the flower, which is sticky, and the pollen adheres to that. That plant has been pollinated, and we then attach one of our trusty little twist ties to indicate that that flower has been pollinated, and we need to come back to that later on and bag it up to collect the seed.
Peter, oh my goodness, that is such a delicate art. You could be a neurosurgeon. So once you've done all that process, you then hang a muslin bag when the seed pod starts to form. Do you store the seeds, or do you sow them immediately?
No, we sow. Hellebore seed needs to be sown fresh.
Yeah.
So we sow them within a few weeks of actually collecting the seed.
Okay, well I think that should be the next thing we go and look at right now.
Let's go.
Off we go.
All right, we've seen how you pollinate hellebores. Now we're at stage 2, I guess, and we're in your propagating house here, surrounded by how many hellebore seedlings would you say, Peter?
Oh, it's probably a couple of 100,000 here.
Goodness gracious me. Now, there's a few things we should know about this. How long have these seedlings been in? They're at their cotyledon stage, so they've all basically got their first set of leaves on them. So how long has that taken?
That's about 7 or 8 months. So they were sown late spring, early summer last year.
So at what point are you going to then prick these out?
Now they can get pricked out pretty well straight away.
So you don't wait for a second set of leaves or anything?
No, you don't need to. No, no.
So you just do it with the cotyledon stage?
Yes, they'll put on a lot of root growth fairly quickly. These ones here, they'll already be to the bottom of the pot.
Ah, fantastic.
Yep.
I can see the remnant seed coats on some of the cotyledons and the germinated seedlings. So how big, in fact, are the seeds of a hellebore?
Well, I've actually got some left over from last year. I can show you.
Good. Now, I've just in passing, I note that you use a coarse sand or gravelly material to go over the top of your seed.
We do.
Which, of course, we discussed in a previous video we've done on seed raising, so we'll link that video below. Is there anything that you need to be aware of, things that you need to stop, funguses, insects, rodents? Is there anything that is a problem at this point?
At this point, well, we need to keep those seed pots sort of moist during the period that we've sown them. We just need to keep those pots sort of watered probably once a week so they don't dry out completely. Once they start to germinate like this, you can see they're quite thick in the pot.
Yeah, they are.
We need to do the occasional spray with a fungicide just to prevent any sort of fungal disease.
Yeah, sort of a botrytis or something.
If you were a non-commercial basis sowing them much more thinly, you wouldn't really have that problem at all.
Now, I notice you're putting these in single pots, but down at the end down there, I notice you've got some that you're doing in trays. So talk me through the differences and why you're looking at the different ways of seed sowing.
Well, that's traditionally how we've done it here, and that sort of started when I used to do it on an amateur basis in my little place in Brunswick 20 odd years ago. Just from a space point of view, we're just exploring now growing them into larger trays, fairly deep trays, as a more efficient use of space in the nursery here. And we're just trialling that to see if they germinate well.
So we probably at this point should go on and see what happens when you prick out your seedlings. I think that's probably the next stage.
That's what we're doing now. Yep.
All right, let's go and have a look. All right, Peter, here we are now at the second stage in the life cycle, I guess, of a hellebore. So what's happening exactly here?
What we're doing here, Penny is pricking these out. So they're the seedlings that we saw before that have germinated in the seed pots. And it's literally a very manual job, separating them carefully. We pot them into those tubes and we grow them on from there.
All right, so how long will they stay in the tubes before the next phase? Because we'll look at that shortly.
Probably about 3 or 4 months. Sometimes we can leave them in the tubes for up to 12 months.
So you might sell them on in tubes, or you might in fact then use them for growing on into bigger pots.
Typically next year we would sell these next year in tubes, so they'd probably be about sort of 6 or 7 months. But to pot them up, they'd be ready to pot up in about 3 or 4 months. They do grow very, very quickly. That's one of the things Hellebores is very strong root growth, which makes them particularly good in the garden. But they do fill these little tubes pretty quickly.
All right, Peter, I think one of the issues for me, although I'm turning,
good,
is the flower and how you can view the flower. So obviously when they're low down, the flowers are pointing down, but you have got this amazing tray of flowers floating. So let's just talk about them as a cut flower. How long is it going to last?
You can, the secret with cutting the flowers is to cut the stems when they're a bit older. So when there's quite a lot of flowers out, so the Hellebore flowers come out sequentially on the stem.
Oh, okay.
So rather than picking the stem when there maybe is just one or two out, wait till they're all out and the stem's hardened up a bit, and it will last longer.
So you can actually cut them as a stem?
You can do that.
Okay.
It depends a little bit on the sort of environment where they're then put. If it's a really hot heated room, they might not last all that long. But the other way to do it is to float them in a bowl.
Now, so these cut flowers down here, how long have those been in there?
They've actually been there since for about 5 days.
And they look as fresh as a daisy, even though they're Hellebores.
Exactly. No, and it's a great way to do it. To float them in a bowl, and they'll last for quite a while, and you get a lovely display depending on how nice your bowl is.
And how long is quite a while? Would they last, you think?
Oh, I would say probably up to a week.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's quite a long time.
Yeah.
And what about if you cut the stem? How long is that going to last?
That again depends a little bit on the environment. So maybe 2 or 3 days, something like that. But I find I get a lot of sort of mixed reports on the cutting the stem.
Yeah.
Some people, it seems to work really well for them. Some people not so much. Whereas the floating them in a bowl works every time.
Excellent. There you go.
Now, time is moving on. We've seen, and you can see right over in the background, the baby pricked out seedlings. So this one, I take it's about a year old?
That's what we did last year, yeah. So about this time last year, we would have pricked that out and put that into that tube.
All right, and this is the sort of plant that you would potentially send out mail order?
Yeah, we start sending them out probably from about March, that size. So we're probably getting towards the end of the season now.
And if I take this little fellow out, it's got a very impressive root system under it. You can see that plant's got good live, healthy root system in there. What would you say about a plant like that?
That's typical, as we were talking before about the root growth that Hellebores put on. It's the characteristic, very strong root growth. And being in that tube for the last year, that's very much filled that. Now, the important thing I just want to mention is that looks like it's a plant that maybe is too densely rooted. But being a perennial, that's easy. You just literally tease that out.
Here we go.
Here we go. Just do that to him. And then pop that in the garden. You can see those roots come out. And being a perennial plant like that, it doesn't hurt it at all.
So because a lot of people get worried about root-bound plants, but that's nearly always about trees and shrubs because they need their roots to support them. So if the roots haven't gone out very far, they can't support themselves. But with perennials, it's not the same issue, is it? So there you go. So that's the sort of plant that you would get mail order. And I guess we need to then look at the next stage. So, well, Peter, now we're in amongst some seriously larger plants, so I think this is rather exciting.
Yeah, Stephen, these are a year older than the ones we've just been looking at. So these are two-year-old plants from germination.
Now, I'm assuming that these are not as marketable as the younger plants because the nursery industry likes smaller, younger plants as a rule. So how would these find their way into people's gardens?
We do sell these directly from the nursery. We do wholesale some of these, but the main purpose of these plants are actually our breeding program.
All right.
So every single one of these has got a fairly detailed tag in it, which has actually got
goodness.
The cross recorded.
Yes.
We grow these onto flowering, so it was the pollinations we did in 2019. Grow these on to assess them as part of our breeding program and whether they make it into the stock house as new stock plants.
I see. So as a commercial nurseryman, I could buy these and resell them in my nursery, but this is more about your breeding lines.
Yeah, we get to pick them out first, which ones we want.
So I don't get the best ones. Oh, that's a bit of a worry. All right, well, I think that's taken us almost to the final level of Hellebores commercially, so that's fantastic. Thank you, Peter.
Peter, this is just fascinating. My world is opening to Hellebores.
I'm glad to hear it, Matthew.
The conversion therapy is working. But now, one thing I noticed when we were over in your pollinating shade house, the size of those pots was pretty large and those plants looked enormous. So how old would those plants be?
Some of those plants might be up to 20 years old. So they're our stock plants that we have had for a long time.
And so they've been in pots for 20 years?
Yes.
How often would you change the medium?
We might refresh them maybe every 5 or 6 years in a pot.
Oh my goodness. So, because my next logical question was, if like me at the moment I'm transient, so I don't have a garden, but if I lived for Hellebores, and I might, you can then essentially grow them as a tub specimen.
You can grow them in pots. Yeah, certain species. So the hybridus, they're good in pots. So this type.
Yeah.
Some of the taller growing coalescent species, so argutifolius and lividus and those, foetidus, those ones are not so good in pots.
Yeah.
They're a bit fussier with their moisture, but these ones will grow in pots. But you do need gradually pot them up each to a different pot size, probably at least once a year.
Yeah, and I think we saw with those first and second year seedlings just how intense the root ball is.
Yeah.
That is great to know. And then if you were growing them in pots, fertilizer, what would you need to do?
Yes, we use a complete control release fertilizer.
Yep.
So the fertilizer of Hellebores needs to be complete. So it needs to have the N, the P, and the K.
Yeah. Nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus.
Correct.
I know my stuff. I don't. Anyway.
And we use a control release fertilizer, which is probably best in a pot situation.
Yeah. Now, here we are. It's Australia. It is mid-winter. We're in Victoria, in southern Australia. Now, what are the climatic ranges that these plants are going to... We're talking about the hybrids, particularly, not necessarily the species. Where is kind of their sweet spot in terms of where to grow them?
They're probably similar, all the hybrids and species in terms of climate. And they just need a temperate climate, so cold winters. Not necessarily arctically cold, but certainly anywhere in Victoria, inland areas of Australia, where the winters are cold. There's a cold, sustained winter, and it's not too humid. They don't like this tropical, semi-tropical sort of area.
So the minute you start to get into humid regions or warmer winters, you can't grow Hellebores. No. What about, here, for example, should you get a wet summer, is that going to affect them?
They can get too wet, a little bit too wet over. That's why you need good drainage for Hellebore. So it's important to have them in an area where there's a good depth of soil, partly because of that big root ball they've got, but just to allow that water to drain away. I've never had a problem in the garden with the sort of rainfall we get here, but if it's very, very, very wet, then probably not such an issue over summer, but certainly over winter. They don't like to get too wet then.
Well, I think our next stop is in your garden to actually then look at how you plant them physically and what conditions you need and the care and maintenance.
Let's go.
Let's go and have a look. Well, Peter, I guess the last part of the equation is where do you plant them? And here we are in your, can I call it a woodland garden?
Yes.
Okay, I will. Deciduous trees, there are hellebores spotted about, so just talk us through the best places to plant hellebores.
Well, in the wild they grow either in or around the edges often of woodlands, or in areas where they're getting some shade in summer, whether that's from extra long grass if they're in a more open area. And that's the key to it, is just having that extra shade in summer. So they want shade in summer, but they want good light in winter. Right, okay, so it's not a woodland plant per se. Not always found in woodland, but I find in a garden situation, if you put them in a deciduous woodland situation, that's what they want. And I guess you've seen them in the wild. You've seen most happen. No, I haven't. No. Oh no. This is all make-believe, Peter. Who are you telling us where to plant hellebores? No. The times I've been overseas is to been collecting plants from nurseries. Right. And usually that doesn't correspond with when they're flowering in the wild. So interesting. Yeah. And in fact, another interesting point that you were mentioning was that Japan has kind of become one of the hot spots of Hellebore breeding. It has, probably in terms of breeding. From my trips overseas at the moment, the Japanese are probably leading. Lots of really, really good work going on there. Lots of incredible breeders. Yeah. And the hybridization then, I presume that would have begun in the late 19th century? Yes, probably in the 19th century in Germany and England, and more recently in the sort of mid to late 20th century in England. Yeah. Lots of work done on working on the hybrids, which come from a range of different species. So some of those wild species that are particularly from the Balkan areas, and working on those, combining them, and coming up with an amazing array of new colours. Yeah. For the gardener out there, what would you say about collecting or trying species versus the hybrids? Once they're in the garden, is there a lot of difference in terms of their care and their needs? Some of the species we mentioned before, the taller growing ones, need very good drainage. So they're a little bit fussier. So things like argutifolius, foetidus, those ones need very good drainage. The hybrids are probably a bit more forgiving in that way. Right. But generally, not a lot of difference. Right. Easier then for the generalists, the hybrids. Yeah, the hybrids would be what I'd recommend. If you haven't grown a Hellebore before, I usually recommend people trying the hybrids. Excellent. Yep. Now the other thing I've noticed is there is a huge variety in the leaf, in the colour and in the striations.
not necessarily the form so much, but a little bit. So is that something that you choose things for when you're deciding which seedlings that you have created?
Some of the varieties we do look at the foliage, and some of the either with the species we very much look at the foliage, because some of those things like Helleborus cross sternii, Helleborus foetidus, you can really treat them pretty much as foliage plants.
Yeah. I was noticing that the greys and the almost variegated speckles, amazing.
Yep. And in the hybrids, we have done some work bringing in some of the rarer acaulescent species that the hybrids are bred from, things like Helleborus herzegovinus, which has got an
from Herzegovina.
Correct. Another,
you see?
A place I haven't been to.
No, nor have I.
With very finely divided, I can have up to 100 leaflets on an individual leaf, and we've actually crossed those with some hybrids to get even more interesting sort of foliage into some of the hybrids.
Because that leads us into a great segue about maintenance, and I think so. I'm revealing my negative thoughts here. One of the things that I understand is that you have to trim the leaves.
You don't have to, but I think it's a good practice. A lot of people do leave the old foliage on their hellebores, but I think around about autumn sometime is a good time to remove the old leaves. Often they're starting to look a little bit tatty by then. And
is it just aesthetics? And is it because then you see the flower more?
No, it's not just, you do see the flower more. It shows off the flower and the plant a lot better.
Yeah.
But it also opens up and cleans up the plant for winter, so that you don't have as much of an issue maybe with fungal problems that you might get if you're leaving a lot of manky old leaves around the plant.
Yeah.
Take those off. It opens up the plant, gets good air movement and good light to the base of the plant, which the plant wants.
Excellent. And I do believe you have cunningly overlooked pruning one of yours, so we might actually see how you go about maintaining them.
Sure.
Let's have a look.
All right, Peter, the once-a-year job of cleaning up your hellebores, you have managed to miss one this year, so you're doing this late, so it wouldn't ordinarily be in flower when you're doing this.
No.
So, although this hasn't been done and should have been, when would you have done it, Peter?
Typically autumn, like mid to late autumn, depending a little bit on the season.
So the buds would be just starting to swell.
You'll probably see the buds,
Yep.
and then you'll also see the old foliage. This is sort of on bigger, older plants. A newly planted seedling that maybe has only been in there for a year or so, you might not do it with, but bigger, older plants are the ones to do.
All right, fantastic. All right, well, you better show us where you cut.
So this is actually a species Hellebore. This is Helleborus liguricus, which is the one that I missed. And when you do take the leaves off, so you can see there's the leaves and the flower stems separately, just avoid the flower stems that we're doing at this time. Normally those flower stems wouldn't be there. I'm cutting the leaves right down at the base, just a little bit off the base. That's done, so you can see that those flowers are much better now.
Well, gentlemen, I am here now to reveal that I love hellebores.
We've converted you at last.
You have, even though conversion therapy is illegal, I have been converted. Peter, thank you so much. This has been so interesting.
It's been a fantastic day out here at Post Office Farm Nursery.
Yes. Now, we'll put the website below, and which is a direct link to Peter, so any questions you can be directed directly to Peter.
More questions, yes, that's fine.
And as we mentioned, the nursery is open Sundays in winter.
Yes.
And online, is that all year?
Online, over from autumn to spring.
Right.
Yeah.
And must point out to our international visitors, alas, you don't ship internationally.
No.
Never mind.
I've got the Holy Grail. I've got a double black.
So, everyone goes on about black flowers being the Holy Grail. Well, you've already achieved that, or it has been achieved for quite some time, hasn't it?
It has, with hellebores at least.
Yes.
There you go. Blue is next, Peter.
I'll work on that next week.
Yeah,
Excellent.
all right, good, fantastic.
Thank you so much for your time today. Very generous.
Thank you, Stephen.
And thank you from me, Peter.
And if you want to know what our continuing adventures might be, hit subscribe. We do post every week. So until then, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Bye all.